Good afternoon. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ahmad Al-Qadi. He's a professor of the Bliss. He's the Bliss Professor of Engineering at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and the director of the Illinois Transportation Center. Prior to UIUC, Professor Al-Qadi was the Charles E. Via Jr. Professor at Virginia Tech. A registered professional engineer, Al-Qadi has co-authored more than 700 publications and has delivered more than 700 presentations, including numerous keynote and distinguished lectures. Professor Al-Qadi has received numerous prestigious national and international honors and awards, including the National Science Foundation Young Investigator Award, the Quadrennial IGS Award, ASCE James Laurel Prize, Artbus Steinberg Award. I think I was there for that one. ASCE Turner Award, French Limoges Medal. He's a former president of the ASCE TNDI Board of Governors and the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Pavement Engineering. In 2010, he was elected as the highest honor bestowed by ASCE. Dr. Al-Qadi holds a Ph.D. from Penn State.
Thank you so much. I think that's a long introduction for a moderator, but I'm very pleased to be here and equally pleased to introduce my student. The next speaker is Egemen Okte. He graduated from the Middle East Technical University in Turkey and then continued his master's and Ph.D. at the University of Illinois. He should be defending his Ph.D. in the next couple of months. And he already accepted a position as a research assistant professor at University of Massachusetts. He's one of the most talented students that I had, and he have received several awards. But away from being an excellent scholar and academic, he is also an athletic. He was leading the water polo team, and he is also the captain for the not regular team because we don't have one at the University of Illinois, but he is also the captain for the water polo team at the University of Illinois. So to give you a little background about the research that he's going to be presenting today, part of the support from CCAT, which University of Illinois is a partner with, we have a project that involves 4 different aspects regarding platooning. One of them is to deal with the impact of the wind on the platoons and to optimize the number of trucks in the platoons. The second one is to give the guidance for the platoons. The third one is the impact of the platoons on the infrastructure. And the fourth one is related to the last mile delivery. And right now we're putting all these 4 different areas in order to do an insight project between Chicago and Rantoul to demonstrate the effective or the work that has been done on platooning. Without further explanation about this, I think Egemen will be discussing here the impact of the platoons on the infrastructure. Please join me to welcome Egemen.
Well, thank you, Professor Al-Qadi. Whenever you introduce me, I just feel like I cannot do much better in my presentation. So I really appreciate that. Well, thank you for showing up. So today I would be talking about a part of this whole project that we just talked about, and we are going to look at how these autonomous connected vehicles are actually interacting with our roads and see what we can learn and what we can do about this problem. So to give you a little bit of a background, in 2019, we hold 73% of all of the nation's freight in these trucks. So we are really talking about a lot of tonnage. And this is projected to go up to 15 billion tons soon. And the distance traveled by these trucks were 177 million miles, which is the distance to the sun and back. So really we're talking about a lot of, and so even the smallest thing that could be changing trucking will really have a big change in our whole how we run this society. So there are some problems in this current freight that I would like to talk about. The first one is the driver shortage. As of last year, there has been a shortage of approximately 60,000 people. So that's a lot when you think about how many packages we need to move just in one given day. And the cost is really high. It's the mode that has the highest cost. It's almost 3 times the rail. So that's also something that we have to look into. The third is the safety. Trucks make only 5% of the vehicle population, but they are responsible for approximately 10% of all the fatalities. So really, that's something that we have to look at. The fourth, I know it keeps going, but the fourth is the congestion. And just in Chicago, in last year, over a 50-mile corridor, there was a congestion cost of $300 million. So really, we're talking about a lot of loss of money. And finally, but of course, not least, we have the fuel consumption. Again, just as I mentioned, we are talking about only 5% of the vehicle population, but they're responsible for consuming over 20% of this fuel. So there is something that needs to be done about this, and people have been working on this, and the solution comes in the form of what we call the truck platooning. And how this works basically is on the left, I'm showing you only some of the companies that have been working on this. These are the vehicles that will travel very closely to one another, and they're really good at keeping their position within the lane. So with this, it was shown that they can save approximately 5 to 15% fuel, which is a lot when you think about it. And level 3 has been tested in the field already, and we're currently working on the level 4. So really, if we were to go back to the previous slide, we can see that platooning really solves, or actually, not really solves, but sort of looks at some of these problems. It solves the driver shortage by maybe removing the second, third driver from a platoon. It is expected to reduce the cost. It's expected to increase the safety, decrease the congestion because the vehicles are much closer to one another. So that actually increases the capacity. And as I just mentioned, we are expected to save around 5 to 15% fuel. So that really makes a difference. But the one thing that I have not talked about is how these trucks are going to interact with the load. The reason I said this is because the reason these trucks are saving so much fuel is because they are really good at keeping their position, and they're really good at following each other, right? So how is this going to change how we design the pavements? And here's a picture from a test that people has done. So this can be a big problem, but you might be thinking, well, this is a test. I mean, this can never happen in the real world. Here's a picture from an actual section. When the lane is really tiny, the drivers have to stay in the lane, and then you still get the same problem. So this is something that we need to look at, and this is part of what I will be talking about today. So one solution that you may think of is you can say, okay, well, let's think about a solution where we just slightly shift the positions of these platoons so that we sort of distribute this load, right? So we have to find a framework for which that we can do this. So with that long, introduction, here are the 4 things that we want to look at. First, can we find which sections of the roadway can these vehicles platoon in the first place? Because it's an important thing that we need to know to design these roads. 2, what is the, on the pavement, how will this following distance here will change how we need to design the pavements? how will this lateral position will change the way that we need to design the pavements. And finally, if we look at this problem from a 40-year, 50-year perspective, is it still a good idea to platoon? So these are the 4 that we're going to look at in the remaining 25 minutes or so, and then hopefully we'll have some questions and answers. So again, we're going to look at the platoonable segments, we're going to look at the impact of the spacing, and then the impact of the position on the lane, and then we're going to look at the life cycle of this. So to start with the first, we first need to think about what it means or what is required for the trucks to platoon, right? So the first thing you can think of is you need to maintain your speed at a high rate. So you don't want to be in a situation where you need to like stop, start, because that's not going to be saving you much fuel. So you need to be in a traffic regime where you can save fuel. 2, if you're not in a platoon, but you're in a passenger car, you don't want the platoon to prevent you from changing lanes. You don't want the platoon from preventing you from taking an exit, right? So these are the 2 things that we really want to look at a high level when you think about a network. So here's the first one, right? We don't want to be in a situation like this where you don't have control of your speed because you're not going to be able to save fuel if somebody just hits the brakes in front of you. And this is a second possible thing that you can see that we don't want to see this, right? So we have to find a way to look at a network and say, okay, maybe we can platoon here, but we cannot platoon here. So with these 2 things in mind, what we did is we took the entire state of Illinois and we looked at all the highway routes, and we looked at each segment to see how many times in a given 20-mile segment are these platoons going to see a vehicle trying to merge, and what is the traffic density. So then, based on this, we said, well, so we looked at some work that people has done, and people has been saying that if your level of service is below C, which is here, 0.7, let me see if this works. Maybe not, so let me go over here. If your level of service is below C, like over here, or if you have less than 4 of these interactions between the platoon and the vehicles, then you can platoon on that network. If you are higher than that, then you cannot platoon. So by doing this, we can really look at a whole network and then see what sections are platoonable. So in this example, I'm showing you at peak hours what parts of the section is platoonable. And Chicago is right here. So as you may expect, we cannot really platoon in Chicago at 7 in the morning, right? Because there's a lot of traffic. So we did this exercise for different traffic levels. So the one that I was just showing you is the here, which is at the peak hours. And the ones that are platoonable are really the sum of the level 1, 2, and 3. So if we look at a time where you don't have a lot of traffic, then the amount of platoonable sections is even higher, right? And what I have been showing you is for 5 trucks and with 65 feet of spacing between them. So this is the result. If you change this, well, let's say you have only 2, and they have 10 feet of spacing, you are interacting less with the car, so more of the section will be platoonable, right? So that was the thing that we looked at and decided what sections are platoonable and what sections are not platoonable. So once we found what is platoonable, we have to find how does the platooning actually changes the way we look at the pavements, right? So we're going to start with the impact of the spacing first. So what we really want to look at here is if we load this material too fast, will it fully recover before we load it a second time? Because if it does, it is going to be a problem, right? We don't want to put this material under a condition that we did not design for. So this is really the main thing that we would like to look at. And the way we looked at it is we run some finite element analysis. And what we wanted to look at is what is the recovery time once you pass a tire? What is the recovery time that is needed for this responses, the stresses and the strain to come back to zero, right? So here's what they may look like. In our finite element simulation, you're just rolling a tire and look at how fast the responses recover. And really what we want to see, right, if this is the last tandem of the first truck and then another truck is coming, depending on how long I travel on this line, the next truck is going to load it again. So there are going to be some strains and stresses that are not fully recovered. So we have to look at how much these are. So based on the finite element analysis, we found that actually these recover really fast. And what I mean by fast is if you are traveling at 70 miles an hour at a 10 feet of spacing, it takes approximately 0.1 seconds for the next truck to load the same point. So if you look at here, we have almost fully recovered our responses within that 0.1 second. But I would like to say that this is just a finite element analysis, and we also have to look at it in the lab to see if this actually holds. And we're in the process of doing that. This has not been completed yet, but what we have seen, and we're still looking at why, is if you do this experiment in the lab, as you increase the rest period, you actually increase the rate of permanent deformation. And I can talk a lot about this, why this happens, but since this is not the main scope of this, I'm just going to move on from this. But this is something that we are currently looking at. So the next thing I'm going to look at is how this impact of lane position or the pictures that I show you will change how we will design these pavements. So I want to take a quick detour for the ones who do not know how to design pavements, which is completely fine, of course. In the US, a large portion of the network is what we call the flexible pavements. And here is what it really will look like. You have a flexible surface, a base, and then a subgrade. So what you may want to do is you may want to take the most common load on the road, and then put that load on a simulation software. It could be finite element, it could be something else, and then what you want to get from this are the stresses and the strains of this pavement. And then once you have that, what you can do is you can use some transfer functions to see how that will be actually looking like in the field in terms of the permanent deformation and the cracking, which are the two load-related distresses. And this whole thing is called the mechanistic empirical pavement design because it has two legs, right? So how would we incorporate, I have not talked about the position of the tire in this framework. Well, the position of the tire is really, it's simply is with just a shift in this response. If you shift the tire a foot this way, the whole response is just going to shift a foot that way. So if we can find a way to formulate how the shift will look for a human-driven configuration, like versus in a CAV configuration, then we will solve our problem, right? So if we look at a CAV case that I just would describe, that we say, okay, say, we can say that like in this case, I guess it's like 1/3 of you will be in the middle, and 1/3 will be on the left, and 1/3 will be on the right. So this will look like a probability distribution that will look something like this. And then, of course, on the top of this, we have to add the humans, because we're not going to remove them on the first day, right? We're still going to be on these rows. So we have to take this into the consideration. So you might get at the end is this thing that looks kind of like a helmet, is what it may look like if you have a mixture, right, of humans and these vehicles that are really good at knowing where they are, right? And then because this is happening over and over and over again, we don't really care about one response. But what we really care about is what's going to happen in 5 years, or 10 years, 15 years. So when you have something that is not deterministic, but it happens like over and over again, what could be very useful is to compute the mean of this thing, right? So if the position of the vehicle keeps changing and changing and changing, but it happens over and over again, well, you can just find the mean of this, and hopefully that mean will give you an idea of what that will look like over a very long time, right? So that's the main idea, but let me just show you how this would actually look like. So we're going to look at the section that has a 5-inch thick layer, and then a base, and then a subgrade. And then we're going to load it with this truck with our logos. So that's nice. That's 1,000 of these a day. And we are going to look at 4 different traffic regimes, right? And I'm going to show them to you here. The first one is human. So we follow somewhat a normal distribution. We have the channelized, in which we are forcing 100% of these vehicles to be in the center lane. We have 40% of connected and autonomous vehicles where we shift them to the left and the right of the lane. And we have the case where like all of them are connected and autonomous, and we shift them, okay? So what we want to look at is how this will change the distresses on the pavement in a span of, let's say, 10 years. So if we look at first in the case of rutting, which is the permanent deformation, like the picture I showed you on the surface, here is what it would look like for a human, right? It's our benchmark. For channelized, you have like a lot more of this, which you might expect because you're loading the same position over and over and over again. When you enter some amount of mixed, you will decrease this a lot, significantly. And then if you push it further, you're still going to get some returns, but it's not going to be as significant. So really, what we found is you get a lot of returns within the first few percentage of these vehicles. If you can just shift the first few percentage, you get a lot of gains from it. The same thing for cracking. We can look at, we have a baseline for humans, which channelized is much worse, mixed is much better. And if you give me a little bit more flexibility, I can make it a little bit better. But again, I already used a lot of what I had with the first few percentage. And the question that you might be thinking at this point, like, how do you decide where to put these vehicles, right? Like, do you shift them by a foot? Like, do you shift them by half a foot, right? How do you decide that? So we looked at that exact question, and what we found, for example, is if you put it in a scheme like this, where you put more on the left and right and a little bit less in the center, you get the best result. But please keep in mind that, like what I showed you here, really the first few percent that you will shift, you will get the best results. So really, this is the best, but you don't have to make it this complicated to reduce your pavement damage. Like you can make it a lot less complicated and still get a lot of returns. Okay, so last but not least, we have to look at the whole life cycle. And I want to take a detour number 2 and really tell you what I mean by the life cycle. So we are talking about, of course, the sustainability of this project. And for this part, we're going to be talking about the first two. The third one, social, is really crucial, but it's something that we have not looked at within the scope of this project. So really what we have to do is to look at like all of the phases of a given project, from the point of where you get your materials, how you put them on the field, all the way to the end until you're done with it, and what are you going to do with this pavement? I have to look at the whole thing. And for a typical system, we find that the majority of the cost and the use is actually coming from the use stage, which is the stage where the vehicles interact with the pavement. So the rougher your pavement is, the more fuel you're going to consume, right? So we have to keep that in mind. So with this big picture in mind, hopefully it makes some sense. We looked at these 4 different structures, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you the result for the first, and the rest really follows it. And I'm hoping that will put the case to bed, hopefully. So again, we're going to look at these 4 different traffic regimes, right? So again, we have the channelized, we have the human, we have mixed, where part of it is channelized and part of it is human, and we have the case where we put them in the way that we wanted. So if we look at the condition of the pavement, we're going to look at the pavement, how smooth the pavement is. So higher the number, the less smooth the pavement is, right? So in the case that is worse, of course, in the previous case is the channelized, and the ones that's the best is optimized. But remember that we have to also look at a 40-year life. So we have to go and do some mill and overlay to this pavement within the span of these 40 years. So the first case that I'm going to show you is a case where I go back and fix the road at year 10, 20, 30, and 40. And then I'm going to look at how this actually changes how I look at the life of this pavement. So let's first look at how much fuel I consume due to the roughness, the excessive roughness. So as you might expect, the one that's the highest is the channelized, right? Because the pavement is the most rough. So I'm consuming the most amount of fuel to drive on that road. And the one that's the least is this one. But on top of this, we have to add the savings we got from platooning, right? Because when I platoon, I just said we save 5 to 15% fuel. So we have to put this on top of this. And because I was saying that we're doing this at 10, 20, 30, and 40 years, when you look at the cost of building and maintaining, that will stay the same because we are not changing that within this scenario. We have some others that we do change, but this is the one where we don't. So if I now talk about the user cost, which is really the summation of the consumption due to roughness and the reduction due to platooning, I'll get an overall cost that will look like this. And if I just sum up the two, I'll get an overall trend that you can see that, yes, even channelized with traffic is better than human because you're platooning. But if you just let me push these trucks a bit to the left and right, I can make you save a lot more fuel. I can make you save a lot more money. So just to show you without that breakdown, again, this is the same graph, but without the roughness and fuel consumption. And if we look at this from not a cost perspective, but from how much energy do I need for this system? We get the same thing again. We have a constant when you look at the materials and construction. When you look at the user, we have a trend that is decreasing, and it's the least in the case of optimized. And if you look at the sum, we really see that if you let me just push these trucks a bit, we can save a lot of fuel, we can save a lot of money, and we can reduce our impact. So in summary, we looked at these sections and found which ones we can platoon on. And we looked at for the ones we can platoon, how will the platooning actually change how we look at the lifetime of this payment. And we found that you can reduce the cost by almost 50%, which is really significant when you think about it. So before I finish, I have to thank Dr. Al-Qadi, who is here, who just introduced me, and all the PIs and the students who have worked on this with me, and of course the CCAT, who has funded a big part of this project. So, well, thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I would like to have them now.
And we'll take questions.
Hi, Egemen. I really love your presentation. It's a complete story about how truck platooning affect the pavement and their performance like. So my question is there any maximum spacing to define a platooning, like between two trucks?
Right. I think that's a really good question. Let me just go back to, so I didn't mention this, but we looked at this spacing only in terms of how will the pavement will be affected. But there's also a human factor and a safety factor that we have not looked at. But from the side of the pavements, we found that if it's below 10 feet, it might be bad. But if you exceed 10 feet of spacing, you are fine. But again, this is only for the pavement. So I do not know if that will hold when you come into the realm of safety. We will probably have to look at some other ways to define what that would mean. Does that answer your question or no?
So 10 feet is corresponding to 0.1 second.
0.1 second at 70 miles an hour.
Sorry.
I know it's 0.1 seconds at 70 miles an hour traveling speed.
Okay.
And I know it's short, and I don't think we are really going to see this for a very, very long time. We are probably going to start with 100, 150, and then as we get more comfortable, this will probably come down. But this is what the finite element is showing us, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And how do you consider the alignment of the axles of the truck you use? Like how many axles of the truck?
Well, what do you mean by that? Sorry, how do you?
Is that a class 9 truck or which class?
Yes, we are looking at class 9 trucks. So we have single, tandem, right? And then the next single will be following. So we looked at the worst case scenario where the last tandem is in the exact same line with the next single. It's not shifted to the left and right. It's directly on the same line.
So what's the spacing between the two tandems? Do you know that?
The spacing between the tandems should be 4.5 feet, between two tires, right?
Yeah.
So that's what you saw here. The one on the top is the response of just one tandem. So you can see the first tire, the second tire. Okay. So that would be the one that is for tandem.
Okay, got it.
Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Very impressive presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes. And actually, the current, if I may also, as a moderator, the current space that you have between trucks is usually between 250 to 300 feet, and different from one state to another state. Like Florida, they do require 300 feet. I think what we're going to be seeing in the near future, it's going to go to maybe 60, 70 feet, but not less than that. So the 10 feet that Egemen is talking about is just the pavement response, which is similar to what you're getting from two tandem. And that was based on the finite element simulation that he was showing. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. This is Yun Chang from Purdue. My question is, will your result be different for different types of pavement, like flexible pavement versus concrete, rigid pavement?
Well, that is a really good question. So my thesis, I looked at this, and I'll be happy to send you my dissertation once I'm done with that. Yes, it changes a bit. I have not looked at the concrete pavement side. I have only looked at the flexible pavement side, but I know that like Professor Al-Qadi would like to say something about the pumping, because I know, well, that's something that we have been talking about when it comes to the concrete pavements, but that's something that I personally have not looked at. But within the flexible pavement, there is a bit of a difference. Like, for example, the thicker it is, the less important it is to shift, because the stress is really distribute. So if you have a really thick pavement, it doesn't really matter how much you shift, but for the thin ones, it matters a lot more. Hope that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think I can comment also on that. I think for flexible pavement, the main concern, because it's a viscoelastic material, you are more concerned about the rutting, as Egemen mentioned, and also the healing. So that's why we were looking more into the flexible pavement. For the rigid pavement, it's a completely different mechanism. In rigid pavement, you're going to be concerned about the frequency. So when you have these platoons close to each other, they're going to go to the joints and they're going to start applying a frequency, and that will be causing loss of support. And I'm sure many of you here, you see it a lot in Michigan when you're driving on concrete pavements, usually feel like this, right? So you're going to feel this more with the platoons, so unless they're going to stabilize it. So other questions? Yes, ma'am.
This is usually from Purdue. So I guess my question is not that technical. It's more related to human factors. So I'm trying to imagine that in the future, if you see those closely followed platoon, and otherwise they do have some lateral shift, as in your research. So as a human driver, I may feel extra burden when I try to pass those huge platoon. So do you have any consideration about this question?
Yeah, so I think, well, that's a really, really good question that we did think about. The first thing we did is to make sure that you don't shift these trucks like a lot. So we gave them approximately a foot from the edge. But again, well, that's definitely something that we have to look at to see how humans will actually perceive even that foot of a shift. Is that going to have an impact on if I want to pass these vehicles? Will I still feel comfortable? I don't know that right now, but to combat that, we did give that foot of spacing. So you're not exactly on the center line, but you're a little bit shifted to the center. And for the platoonable sections part, it's still the same thing. There are some people that look at human factors, and what they found and what they're currently doing is that humans really prefer platoons that are maybe 2 or 3 trucks. So when you make it 5, 6, they're not very comfortable with that. But I don't know how that will be in the future, because as you said, it's all about perception, and we're not used to seeing platoons of that size. So if we are exposed to it, well, that might be a change in the future, but that's something that is really important, but it's not something that we have looked at here.
That's an excellent question. Actually, we do see platooning right now when you are on the interstate highway. I mean, the drivers are very smart and they like to save fuel, so you see them driving behind each other. Now, the lateral positioning that you were talking about, I don't think you're going to feel it that much unless somebody going to decide at one point they're going to reduce the lane width from 12 to 11, which I'm completely disagree. And I think what Egemen presented today is just to say that this is going to be a very, very dangerous proposal, because I read that there is proposals to, with autonomous and connected vehicle, to shorten the width of the lane. And I think that's going to be dangerous, as you can see in the presentation. But the optimization that you presented was ultimately to go 18-inch to the left and 18-inch to the right. And when you see them, you will not feel them, but I'm not the human factor expert here, so definitely some studies on that are needed. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. Continue.
Hi, Daniel Salivar, Purdue University. Thank you for the great presentation. I basically have two questions. One is, which way do you think is the best way to actually decide where are you in the lane? Would that be GPS technology or would that be lane detection? And I know both of them have their own problems. And the other one is, how would you know if the platoon that is currently going through the road has to be on which side of the road? Do you need some sort of centralized system that is assigning positions, or is it something like a roadside unit that is keeping track of what the platoons are doing?
So yeah, well, that's an excellent question. For your first question, we have an expert here who defended his thesis on this topic. So he has been working on some technologies that you can put in the pavement, and you have some sensors that will detect the location of the vehicle based on where you are in relation to that sensor. So that's something that Sachindra was looking at. So
yeah, I think he has a poster tomorrow.
Yes, and he has a poster tomorrow about this very thing at 1. So I don't want to take away his thunder. I'm sure he knows a lot more about that than I do. But regarding your second question, the reason why we define this as a mixed probability distribution is it doesn't matter. You can just say to the platoon, randomly pick one of these 3. It doesn't really matter if you do this first and then this and then that, because overall, the mean will still be the same. Maybe within the first week, it might be a little bit different, but overall in 5-10 years, it will converge to the same thing.
Yeah. No, but I think Egemen, also we did look into the centralized where they have to be communicated. So there will be a communication to answer your question. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
We did look at that as well. Yes.
Other questions? It's so Egemen, when do you think the platooning going to be happening? That's maybe what everybody's going to be asking.
When I started working on this project, they said, 2020. It's
okay.
2022. So I'm assuming soon, because we've seen, especially with Germany, a lot of field testing. But I think the US is still a little bit behind when it comes to field testing. So I am assuming within the next 5 years, but that's what I said 2 years ago. So I have only 3 years left now.
So will I see it before my retirement?
Yes, because I'm assuming you you have another 50, 60 years, I'm assuming. So yeah, you will see that before you retire.
Yeah, I think there is a different system in Australia that where they have the trucks behind each other, and it has been working really well. I think in the United States, it's mostly, we could not find that system on our roads because of political reasons. So every few years, we have something in the Congress regarding the increase of the weight and size, and that's something they consider it, they're going to be a change on the weight. But I do believe that the benefits going to weight the cost to the infrastructure as well, the platoons. So I think we're going to be seeing this happening, no question about it. The only difference here is talking with the trucking industry. I think we're going to be seeing it more as connected trucks and not autonomous trucks. So you're going to be seeing more of the connections which happening already. And something interesting, one of the companies we're talking about is the lead truck will be even in the back rather than in the front for some safety reasons too. So any other questions? All right, so it seems that got all the questions here. Egemen, thank you again for your excellent presentation, and thank you for your questions.